guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to talk about turning your traditional media illustrations, getting your traditional media illustrations onto your computer, and everything that kind of goes into the process of digitizing traditional media illustrations. Two disclosures. First one is this video, like many of our recent ones, has been inspired by you all. So there was an initial question, and then I opened it up for more questions on Instagram, and there was a huge response, way more than I expected. So some of these questions have been kind of merged together or cut into pieces and pasted with another one. So you may not recognize your specific question, but I think I am going to address all of the topics that are in here. And then there aren't going to be any attributions with these questions because I have kind of Frankensteined them so much. So there's a couple really specific ones that are mostly intact at the end, but for the most part, we're just going to do these rapid fire. They're shorter questions, so hopefully I can make them shorter answers. And then the other disclosure is that I will be looking down at my computer. Usually I film at my table and I have my camera in front of me, but the lighting in here, I'm still figuring it out. It may even change in this video. So I'm sitting in a little bit of a different arrangement today and have my computer down here. So if you see me looking down, that is why. All right, the first question is why to digitize traditional art at all? Or why would you want to digitize traditional art at all? And answer to that is multifold. There's a few answers. Number one, you might just want to be putting it online. You might want to share it with somebody. You might want to put it in an email. You might want to put it on Instagram, on your portfolio, on wherever else people are putting things online these days. The other reason is that you might want to reproduce it somehow. So you might want to make prints yourself. You might want to put it on t-shirts. You might want to license it to a client, or a client might want to commission you to make something that they're going to put in a magazine or on an ad or on fabric or whatever, any sort of reproduction of it. To reproduce something that's made traditionally, you first have to get it onto a computer. Next question, what edits are usually done to scan to traditional illustration, and why? So this kind of depends on the style of illustration and the end use of the illustration. But for me, the most common edit that I usually do is just removing the background. So if you are familiar with my style, most of my work is just a subject on a white background. So most of the time my clients are wanting to have either a pure white background or to have a clear background. So that's probably the biggest thing that I do, the most frequent thing that I do, and I do it really to any illustration that I scan. And then something else that I do semi-frequently, but not every time, is to adjust color. So I'm never, making something blue and then changing it to green. Well, actually, no, I do that sometimes too, very occasionally. But when I say adjust color, I mostly mean tweak it slightly. So maybe the client wants it a little bit less saturated. So the easiest way to do that is to just dial back the saturation digitally, as opposed to going back over it to try to desaturate with like colored pencil or paint or something. So yes, removing the background, tweaking the color, and then I do sometimes fix little imperfections. So like if there's a spot or a splotch that ended up where I didn't want it, or maybe a little scratch or a piece of dust or something that's gotten in the scan, I will fix it that way. Next question, do you scan or take a picture? And then what do I do if I don't have a scanner? This is pretty straightforward. I wish I had more of a nuanced answer here, or could tell you really you can do whatever works. But honestly, if you want to work commercially, if you want to work as a professional illustrator, and really even if you want to make your own reproductions, it really is best to have a scanner. So there are some situations where you would want to have a camera, like if you are doing really massive artwork, or artwork that it's not just dimensional as in like being on a canvas, but like actually has dimension to it. So like really thick impasto paint would be a good example. Certain kinds of encaustic or maybe more sculptural pieces you would want to use a camera for. There are a lot of really great, really decent, affordable scanners on the market. So you do not have to be spending thousands of dollars on a scanner. The scanner I have was about $200. There are plenty in the $100 range that would work. I will link both my scanner and another recommendation that's cheaper, maybe around $100, in the description box. And in fact, as far as that scanner to camera comparison goes, really you would need, you could do a $200 scanner which is relatively speaking in the more affordable range. But for a camera, what you would need is a pretty nice camera and a decent tripod and maybe even a swing arm, because just like holding your phone over something, even if you have it propped up and you're, angling yourself just right, you're still going to get some distortion there depending on the angle. So you really do need to have the tripod, and then to get something that's sharp enough, that's crisp enough to be able to reproduce it well, you need a higher end camera. One other option that you could do here is to call around to some local print shops. So a lot of the time places where you might get something scanned or copied, where you might get something printed or copied, they will also scan things for you. So you have to tell them how you want it scanned and how you need it scanned, which we'll talk about in a moment. But that is another option too. Like if you're in a situation where you just want to try it out with one or two pieces and you're not sure yet whether you want to invest in a scanner, that could be something you might try. Next question, what software do you use? So I'm a big fan of Pixelmator, which is basically just like a Photoshop knockoff. So I don't like, I've talked about this in several different places before, but I really don't like the idea of the Adobe Creative Cloud subscription. And even before it was Creative Cloud, it was just so darn expensive. And I'm not like, I know Photoshop is an incredible program and there are artists who use it to amazing results. They make amazing things with it, but I'm not using it for that. All I'd be doing is these small color adjustments and cutting out a background. So I really don't need something with that much horsepower. So for me, Pixelmator, which I believe is around $50, and it's a buy thing. It's not a subscription. So you buy it one time and then you have it. It has more than enough utility for me. It's really all I need. Next question, best DPI for scanning. So the best DPI depends on what you're going to use the scan for. Generally, I scan everything at somewhere between 300 DPI and 700 DPI. You can scan it at higher densities, like 1200. I think my scanner goes up to maybe like something crazy, like in the tens of thousands, something that's absurd that I would never, who knows, maybe somebody's going to use it at that level, but the larger you get, the bigger, the greater the pixel density, the longer it's going to take to scan. And then those are just going to be absolutely enormous files. So there's a limit to how much benefit you get to doing it really large. There would be occasional times when I might scan something in at 1200. I used to do all my files at 1200 because I was like, maybe I'll need to make it super big, but they just take up so much space. So now I do everything at 300 to 700. I haven't ever had a client ask for anything more than 600. Even for large scale reproductions. So for printing like billboards and banners and stuff at trade shows, they've always just wanted between usually 400 and 600 DPI for that. So if you scan it between 300 and 700, you should be good. And then if you're going to want to use those illustrations online or for something digital, then you should shrink it down to somewhere between 72 DPI and 150 DPI. You could just scan at 72 DPI, but then if you ever want to print that thing later or reproduce it in a different way besides digital reproduction, so besides just having it on your portfolio, if you want to actually like put it on something, then you'll have to rescan it and re-edit it and do all of that again. So I find it's just way easier to scan at a higher quality and then export at different smaller sizes if you need other uses. What are the best file types? Best file types to print from? And then is there an expected file type for commercial clients? So I use several different file types. They're probably all ones that you've heard of. I use JPEGs, TIFFs, PNGs, PSD, which is Photoshop, and I'll explain how I get that in a minute, and then very occasionally PDFs. So really, I think these are the main types that any traditional media artist would want to use. There are some additional file types like SVG or EPS that you may have heard of. Those are more for digital illustrators or for illustrators who have vectorized their work, which I never do. But if you are a traditional media artist like me who scans things in JPEG, TIFF, PNG, PSD, those should be your main 4 files. So I'll just run down the list of what I use each one for. So JPEG is probably my most common file. By common, I mean I do the most different things with it. So when I scan an illustration with my scanner, it starts out as a high quality JPEG. All of my art prints, so everything that I print with my fine art printer, those prints all start as JPEGs. And then I also use JPEG, so the third way I use JPEG is to deliver client rough drafts. So I will compress the JPEG down. It's really easy to, JPEG by itself already has a compression in it. So it's easy to compress the file and get it smaller. So I'll send sketches that way. I send rough drafts that way. And then occasionally some high-res finals are delivered as JPEG. So I'll just ask clients, or, I often will say, based on the project description, like if I know they're going to want to use it online, I will just suggest that I'm going to deliver it as a PNG. If I know that they're going to want to use it in print, I will suggest that I'll deliver it as a TIFF or a PSD. But if the client requests a JPEG, sometimes I have clients that request a JPEG. So in that case, I will do it. I'll do the high-res JPEG. The one thing to keep in mind about a JPEG is that you can't have a transparent background. So your background can be pure white, but it can't be clear. You can't have a clear background. All right, the next type that I use is a TIFF. TIFF, I would say, is more common for larger projects. So for packaging projects, for advertising projects, TIFF is a really common file type there. TIFF, you can have a clear background, and that's helpful because a lot of clients that are in that space want to have the clear background. They want to be able to use it in a lot of different ways. So that's a key difference between a TIFF and a JPEG there. That's the reason I would go for a TIFF over the JPEG, is because I can have that clear background and it can still be a really high quality file that's good for printing. Next up is a PNG. I don't use PNGs a ton. I really only use PNGs for clients whose end use is digital. So if it's a digital spot illustration, it might be a PNG. If it's an illustration that someone's going to use on their website or social media, it might be a PNG. Actually, social media, it probably would be a JPEG, but if they're going to use it on their website, if they want to have a clear background. So PNG and TIFF are the two files that work really well for having a clear background. PNG is not usually used for print. So if you need that clear background, use the TIFF. If you don't need the clear background, use a high-res, a full quality JPEG. And then next up is a PSD. PSD is the Photoshop file. So one of the great things about Pixelmator is it lets me still export something as a Photoshop file. It preserves all of the different layers. So sometimes, especially if it's a larger commercial project, particularly for packaging, I may be compositing multiple different illustrations, each in their own layer, to create one image, and being able to export that in a way that preserves all the layers so that the client has the most flexibility with it down the road can be helpful. So that's a reason why I would use a Photoshop file. And then lastly, very, very occasionally, I'll use a PDF. I really only use a PDF for my own purposes. Like if I'm getting something printed, usually promo or mailers or business cards, I will do as a PDF. And that's because I will look up, like on Moo or whatever printer I'm using, I'll look up their color space that they're going to use, and then edit my illustration to be in that color space and export it so that it matches whatever color profile they're going to be using as a PDF. The PDF is more of like the final layout file. So PDF is really only, for me, it's really only something that I do for personal mailers, promo, that sort of thing. All right, what color profile to use? So I have gone back and forth about whether I even want to attempt answering this, because it's really complicated, and we could have an entire video just about this subject, just about this topic. I'm trying to think of how to reassure you and make you feel comfortable that you don't need to like completely understand this in order to work in illustration. I obviously don't. Of course, there are the two big buckets. There's CMYK, which is usually for print, and there's RGB, which is usually for digital. I've already kind of been mentioning these in my last answer. But yes, in my previous answer, I mentioned how when I scan something in, it is automatically in RGB. Most of my clients are at a level now where they understand, if they're commissioning a traditional illustrator who is scanning things in, that they're going to start in the RGB color space. And again, most of my clients just prefer to handle the conversion on their own. But the only time that I myself will actually do a color conversion from RGB to CMYK is, well, 2 times. One, if the client specifically asks me to, and 2, if I'm using a printing service, an online printing service like Moo, then I will do the conversion. But other than that, all of my files that I deliver to clients are in RGB. If you are in doubt, I would say just ask your client what kind of file type they want and if they have a preference on the color space. Especially for commercial clients, most of them should be able to give you a pretty clear answer on that. Next question, is there a standard or expected size for commercial clients? The basic answer to this is that it's whatever size the client wants. And the only expectation I would say is that, say if the client asks for a 5x7, if this is a print client, they will expect that it's going to be in high resolution. So 5x7 inches is the size, but you need to have it at 300, or I would say maybe even like 350 DPI and above. That would be probably a pretty standard expectation with commercial clients, is that they're going to be getting high resolution, unless you have somebody who is commissioning something exclusively for web use. So maybe it's like social media assets. In that case, 72 DPI or maybe 150 DPI would be more standard. But in terms of the specific size, like the aspect ratio, the how wide to how large, how wide to how tall, that's something you should get from the client, information that you should get from the client, and then you should know, are they going to be using it in print or in digital, which will tell you the DPI that you need to deliver. Next question, how to scan big artwork and how to deal with the pieces not matching up. I've done a video about this before. I will try to link that in the description. The way to scan large art, the way I scan large art is in batches. So if your scanner bed is like mine and is 9x12, but you have a 18 by 24 inch illustration, you would basically just scan each corner of the illustration. You try to line it up as carefully as you can with the edge of the scanner, with the edges of the scanner. Again, I go more into detail on this in the video, which I will link, but you scan it in as many pieces as you need to, and then weave those pieces together using a program like Pixelmator or Photoshop if you have it. How to deal with the edges not matching up. So there's 2 reasons that could happen. Say if you have 4 different pieces of the illustration you've scanned and they're just kind of slightly off. It could be because you've got your scanner bed here, and rather than lining up perfectly with the scanner bed, you kind of had the illustration at an angle. So that could make things a little bit tricky and make things not match up. So the solution to that is to just try to, if you have a square illustration, hopefully try to line it up with 2 of the corners in your scanner so that you have nice straight edges. The other thing that can happen is that the scanner bed is a piece of glass, and the scanner, there's 2 little kind of lips on the edge of the scanner, so you can end up kind of pushing the illustration down a little bit and making the edges, it's flat in the center, but then the edges kind of curve up, which can distort the image. And if you're trying to match up 2 curved edges, that is going to cause problems, and it's going to result in a distorted image. So when you are deciding how many pieces to scan in, maybe you can like just barely piece it together if you do 4 scans, and that will just exactly cover up, that will just exactly cover the surface area of your image. But if you do that, you're going to be forced to pair up the different images, the different scans right along the curved edges. I hope this makes sense. What you want to do then is scan in more batches. So say if you need a bare minimum of 4 batches to get the exact surface area, you should try doing 6 batches. That way your images will have enough overlap that you can erase that curved part and then just match them up at the flat part of the image. I hope that makes sense. It should be clear in the video, which is linked below. Next question, how do I get clear or white backgrounds? So my favorite method is erasing or cutting away. Some people will mess around with the contrast or the white balance so that they can kind of wash out the background and end up with a pure white background that way. Some people will apply a mask over the top so that it's non-destructive editing. But honestly, since most of my clients want the transparent background, not just a white background, my favorite method is to get rid of the background altogether. So erase it or cut it away. And I also prefer that for printing. So some people, when they reproduce their art, they want the background. If it's a background that they've worked on, of course, you want the background there. But for me, there isn't any background, and I just think it's cleaner for printing. So I pretty much do this to all of my illustrations unless they happen to have a background. There's a few that I've done over the years that have backgrounds, in which case I don't cut them away. But if it's just the subject on a white piece of paper, then I always cut away the background. That is also something that I have made a video about. I've actually made a couple videos about it, and I made a whole Skillshare class about it. That'll all be in the description box. Next question, how to handle watercolor without clear edges and how to digitize metallic watercolor. So these are both kind of tricky. For watercolor without clear edges, if you're editing something that has a fade to it, that's like really a soft gradient as opposed to a clear hard edge, what I like to do is edit away all of the rest of it. So erase away around all the areas that do have really clear, obvious edges, and then leave a much wider area around that soft gradient, the soft fade. And then I'll go back in and erase that by hand. And I typically will do, like, I'll set my eraser opacity. I'll change my eraser opacity so it's not at 100%. I'll do it, maybe something really low initially, like 10% or 20%, and just kind of start gradually working my way up. So I essentially try to mimic the fade of the watercolor with the fade of the eraser, so that there ends up I'm duplicating or replicating some of that transparency. Now, even if I get that perfect and I have like a really beautiful, really transparent, soft gradient fade all the way from the opaque part of the watercolor down to where it's nice and faded and transparent and clear, even if I do that perfectly, it still is only going to really look good reproduced on a very light background. I hope that makes sense. I don't think I specifically talk about that in the videos. So if in my videos I've done so far on this, so if you guys want to see a demonstration of that, let me know, and I can potentially try to make that video in the future. How can I ensure that a scanned drawing will be sharp when magnified? Basically, no matter how high of a resolution you scan something at, so you could scan your illustration at 1200 by 1200 DPI, which is a huge, really dense, big resolution, very high resolution. Even if you do that, you could still magnify it. Like if we're talking about looking at it on your computer, you could still magnify it enough to where it will look grainy and it will look pixelated. And that's because it's a raster image. It's not a vector image. So there are pixels in it. So anything that has pixels, eventually you will see, it will look pixelated if you zoom in close enough. If this question though is about how to make sure a scanned drawing is sharp when printed or sharp when reproduced at maybe a larger size than it was made at. So like say you want to make an 11 by 14 out of an 8 by 10, you just need to be sure to scan it at a high enough resolution. So that's why I recommend scanning things, minimum to 300 to 350. And I usually go for, if I'm just scanning something for myself, I go for between 400 to 600. So scanning it at a higher resolution will allow you to reproduce it at a larger size and still have it look nice and crisp and clear. Okay, a couple more really specific questions here. 3 more specific questions, and then we are going to wrap up this video. I got the Pixelmator app on my iPad Pro. I love using it, but when I tried to send my art to an art director, the size was too small. Does this mean that I should try to learn Adobe Photoshop or Illustrator to edit my watercolor art instead? So I've already pretty much answered this by this point, but in case it wasn't clear, no, you definitely do not need to learn Photoshop or Illustrator. Pixelmator is perfectly capable of producing high resolution files. That is all that I use. I don't ever use Photoshop. Even if I do export a Photoshop file, I'm doing all of the editing in Pixelmator. I am guessing there's a couple of different areas where you could be hitting a hiccup. 2 main spots where the problem could be the scan resolution or the format of the Pixelmator file. So what could be happening is that you're scanning your illustration in, but maybe you haven't set it to a high enough pixel density. So again, shoot for something in that range that we talked about, the 300 to 700 range. If your client has specifically asked, I would say 350 is probably the default if you haven't had a specific request from a client. So if your client hasn't made a specific ask, hasn't said anything about that, I would say it's probably 350 that they're looking for. So just make sure that you have your scanner set at least to that. And then the other area that you could be hitting a bump here is in the setup setup of the Pixelmator file. So when you open a new file, you will have an opportunity to choose the pixel density, how many pixels it's going to be. So you'll get to choose the size, and the size, as we have discussed, should be based on whatever your client asked for. So if your client wanted a 4x4 inch spot illustration, the canvas should be 4x4 inches. Or if you want to make it a little bit larger, you could still just do a square, and you could do like 8x8 inches or 6x6 inches, whatever. Just make sure you follow their aspect ratio, the proportion of the width to the height. And then be sure that you're setting the pixel density at something that is appropriate for print. I don't want to be diminishing digital artists. I think digital artists are just as skilled. They maybe have some different skills that traditional artists don't have, but for me, traditional is like 100% the way to go. So yeah, I really like the element of surprise. I also really love the texture. To me, it's just very hard to replicate the texture that you can get with traditional illustration with a digital illustration. It can be done somewhat, but takes a lot more work to make a digital illustration look traditional than it does to just make a traditional illustration. So at the end of the day, a digital illustration is usually going to look more like a digital illustration, and a traditional illustration is going to look traditional. So it depends on the look you're going for, the look your client's going for, how much control your client is going to want to have over being able to edit independent layers. So that's a big difference in terms of the end product from the client's perspective. I will say one more thing on this. If this is about a fear that traditional illustration is just going out and really what you need to have is skills in digital illustration, people have been concerned about that for a long time, and it does kind of wax and wane. And I actually feel like now we're in a phase where it's a little bit more cool to do traditional illustration, and where a lot of clients are looking for some of that kind of tactile handmade quality because everything is so digital. I think it's great if you can have some skills in both. So I still consider myself definitely primarily a traditional media illustrator, but I have learned a lot about digital illustration and digital editing just kind of gradually over the years, and I've gotten a lot more comfortable with it. Oh, I remember the one other thing I wanted to say about why I prefer traditional, when I'm working digitally, I don't know why this is, but when I'm working digitally, I feel totally cut off from, mostly cut off from my intuition. When I'm working traditionally, I just have a really good sense of when the piece is done, and it becomes clear to me, oh yeah, I just have this feeling that, okay, it's done now. I have a sense of it being done. And sometimes that's because I know that I can't do anything more to it without ruining it. But with digital, you can keep going indefinitely. And for that reason, I never get into the flow state. I never just feel like I'm trusting my intuition and just really in the process when I'm doing a digital illustration. I'm always like kind of anxious and a little bit stressed and don't enjoy it. And I usually will work on something a lot longer. I'll spend hours making these tiny little tweaks that actually don't make much of a difference. All right. I hope this was a helpful video, you guys. I am quite confident that it's going to be pretty long. But yeah, I will link to those more hands-on demonstration videos and the Skillshare class. I will link to those in the description box. If you have follow-up questions to this, or if you have questions about other topics, you can always leave those in the comments, or you can also visit my website, kendallhillegas.com/questions, and submit your question there. And be sure you're following me on Instagram at Kendall Hillegas, because I will often do call outs for questions, for additional questions. So that's another great way to jump in and join along and get to submit your questions. So thank you to everybody who asked. I hope I answered you well. I hope I provided some good information. And yes, who else? Oh yes, of course. Thank you to Meg. Thank you to my patrons. Thank you for watching, you guys. Thank you for, yes, oh my goodness. I need to go. I need to cut myself off. Okay. Goodbye, everybody. Have a great week. I will see you in the next video. Bye.